You think because I push a mop, I can't solve the Erdos-Strauss conjecture for n equals 997? Eleanor's voice cut through the polished marble hallway of Princeton high scholars. Moments earlier, she was just the janitor. But when a devoted mother watched her brilliant son face expulsion, she made a decision that would silence an entire room of scholars. The autumn wind swept dry maple leaves across the courtyard, their brittle edges scraping against the stone steps. Inside Seminar Room 203, chalk dust floated in the afternoon light like tiny galaxies. Professor Harlan, notorious for his exacting standards, was writing the final question of the day. Prove or disprove. 4 over n equals 1 over a plus 1 over b plus 1 over c for n equals 997. It was the Erdos-Strauss conjecture, an open problem in number theory since 1948. Mathematicians have tested countless values of n, but no one has proven the conjecture for all integers. For a high school seminar, it was meant to be impossible, a showpiece of intellectual intimidation. The room fell silent. Students stared at the equation like it was an artifact from another world. At the far corner, Daniel sat with his pencil hovering above a wrinkled notebook page. His hoodie was worn at the cuffs, and his sneakers were scuffed from walking to school. He didn't look like someone who belonged in Princeton's elite math program. Yet on the lined paper before him, a chain of careful reasoning curved and branched like a river's delta. Daniel had found a solution, not from memory, but by seeing the problem in pictures. He imagined fractions as wooden tiles, each piece cut to fit into the frame of 4 over n. Slowly, he had carved out values of a, b, and c that balanced the equation. When it was his turn, he rose from his chair. Every step toward the board felt like walking uphill against wind. He began writing. Reciprocal decomposition, careful factoring of the prime number 997, a clever rearrangement to isolate integer values for a, b, and c. At the final step, the chalk paused in his hand before the last line. The equation balanced perfectly. A murmur rippled through the room. Professor Harlan's voice cut through. "Where did you get this?" Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "I worked it out." "Sir?" Harlan narrowed his gaze. "Impossible. This approach is almost identical to a method I saw in a Cambridge research draft 15 years ago. Are you telling me you reinvented it exactly?" Daniel's jaw tightened. Before he could answer, Harlan turned to the administrators at the back of the room. "I believe this student has cheated." The words hung heavy in the air, louder than any chalk on slate. Out in the hallway, Eleanor was kneeling beside a mop bucket, rinsing the rag in warm, soapy water. She had worked the afternoon shift for 7 years, and to most, she was just part of the quiet machinery that kept the school immaculate. But when she heard the word Cambridge, her hand froze in the bucket. A pulse of memory. A high-ceiling lecture hall at the Isaac Newton Institute, blackboards rolling from floor to ceiling, the sound of chalk striking like a heartbeat, filled her mind. She stood, set the mop handle against the wall, and listened. The administrators called her in, thinking only to confirm whether Daniel had brought any unauthorized materials into the seminar. Eleanor stepped into the room, her uniform still damp at the sleeves. A few students smirked, surprised to see the janitor under the seminar's bright lights. One board member asked, "Ms. Eleanor, did you see this student with any notes or devices before entering?" She looked at Daniel, saw in his eyes the same spark she'd once seen in another young mind. Years ago, before everything changed. "No," she said slowly and clearly, "nothing but a pencil and a sheet of paper." A professor muttered, "Still, how would a high schooler even know a Cambridge method for the Erdos-Strauss problem?" Eleanor said nothing more. She left the room quietly, returning to her mop. But the light in her eyes had shifted, not the dim light of a worker ignored, but the first flicker of a long, hidden flame. The meeting room smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. It was late afternoon, and the sun was low enough to cast long, golden rectangles through the high windows. Daniel sat in one of the hard wooden chairs at the center of the room, feeling the grain of the armrest under his fingertips. Around him, the members of the school board were settling into their seats, some with files open, others with laptops humming. At the far end of the table, Principal Morton adjusted his glasses and looked at the folder in front of him. He cleared his throat. "Daniel," he began, "the faculty is concerned. While your performance on the problem in Professor Harlan's seminar was impressive, the similarity to a known Cambridge method cannot be ignored." Daniel's stomach tightened. "I didn't copy it," he said softly. From his left, Harlan's voice was sharp enough to cut. "Then prove it. You have 1 month. Show us you can consistently perform at that level on material you could not have possibly seen before. If you fail, you will be removed from the advanced mathematics program." A month. The words echoed in Daniel's head. A month was both too short and too long. Too short to become a different student in the eyes of the professors, too long to live with the threat of losing what he loved most. Principal Morton's tone was final. "You will be evaluated at the end of the month. This is not negotiable." Daniel nodded, even though every part of him wanted to protest. Eleanor was standing at the back of the room with her mop bucket, pretending to polish the floor. She had been told she could leave, but she didn't. Instead, she kept her head bowed, listening to every word. When Daniel was dismissed, he walked past her without looking up. His face was pale, and his shoulders sagged under a weight she recognized too well. Outside, in the empty hallway, Eleanor spoke for the first time. "A month is enough," she said quietly. Daniel stopped and turned, confused. "For what?" "For proving you belong here," she replied. He looked at her, then glanced away. "They think I cheated." "They don't know you," Eleanor said, her voice calm. "They only know what fits into their tidy little boxes. You and I are not boxes, Daniel. We're questions they don't know how to answer." That night, Eleanor didn't go straight home after her shift. She walked past the janitor's closet, past the locked library doors, and into the old mathematics wing where unused blackboards lined the walls. She found one with just enough light from a hallway lamp to see the chalk tray. She picked up a piece of chalk. Her hand hesitated only for a moment before moving, drawing symbols in a rhythm that felt like breathing. Fractions became ratios, ratios became patterns, and patterns folded into elegant symmetries. She was no longer in Princeton High Scholars. She was back in Cambridge, in the Isaac Newton Institute, explaining a proof to colleagues who leaned forward in interest. But tonight, there was no audience, just the quiet scratch of chalk and the smell of dust. She smiled faintly. It had been a long time since she let herself think like this. The next day, Daniel found Eleanor in the hallway between classes. "Do you know much about number theory?" he asked, as if afraid of the answer. "I used to," she said. "Now I know about floor wax and mop heads." Daniel half smiled, not sure if she was joking. "Could you help me? For this month?" Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "If you're ready to work harder than you ever have, yes." Their lessons began that very night in the same unused classroom where Eleanor had drawn on the blackboard. She started not with problems from the advanced syllabus, but with stories. She told Daniel about ancient Egyptian scribes who broke fractions into sums of unique unit fractions, and how that idea had inspired centuries of mathematicians. She described Gauss as a boy, summing an arithmetic series faster than his teacher could finish writing it on the board. "Mathematics is not just numbers," she said. "It's seeing patterns before they are complete and knowing which way they will bend." Daniel worked through problems with her, some from textbooks, others she wrote herself. She refused to give him the answer, only nudging him toward the next insight. One night she set down the chalk and asked him to close his eyes. "Picture this," she said. 4 divided by some number n. Imagine it as a wooden beam. Now cut that beam into 3 smaller beams whose lengths are the reciprocals of 3 whole numbers. That is all the Erdos-Strauss conjecture says. But how you cut it, that's where your mind comes in. Daniel opened his eyes. That actually makes sense. Good, Eleanor said. We're going to make a lot more sense out of things they think are too hard for you. The weeks passed quickly. Each night after her janitorial shift, Eleanor would meet Daniel. She transformed dry formulas into tangible images, prime numbers as indivisible beads, modular arithmetic as a clock face where time wrapped around. Daniel's confidence grew, but so did the challenge. One evening, Eleanor handed him a problem about partitioning integers in multiple ways. It looked deceptively simple. He struggled for hours. "You're making it harder than it is," she said. "Mathematics punishes pride, Daniel. Step back and look again." He did, and the solution clicked into place like a puzzle piece. He grinned. "I get it now." She smiled back, though her eyes seemed far away. One rainy night, Daniel arrived to find Eleanor staring at a black-and-white photograph on the desk. It showed a much younger Eleanor in a lecture hall, standing beside a tall man in a tweed jacket. "Who is that?" Daniel asked. "My husband," she said softly. "He was a mathematician. Brilliant. We worked together in Cambridge until he got sick. When he passed, I stopped everything. Couldn't look at an equation without feeling the loss." Daniel didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Eleanor folded the photo away. "But you remind me of why I started. And I'll be damned if I let them take that from you." As the end of the month approached, word spread that Daniel's final evaluation would be public. Faculty and students whispered in the hallways, curious to see whether the accused prodigy could prove himself. The night before the test, Daniel was restless. He paced the empty classroom while Eleanor sat at the desk. "What if I freeze up?" he asked. "You won't," she said, "because the problem they give you will just be another puzzle piece. And you've learned how to see the whole picture." She stood, placed the chalk in his hand, and closed his fingers around it. "This is just a tool. The real work happens here," she said, tapping his temple. "And here," she added, tapping his chest. On the morning of the evaluation, Daniel walked into the seminar room to find 3 professors seated at the front. A fresh problem was written on the board, something he had never seen before. He took a deep breath, hearing Eleanor's voice in his mind. "Step back. See the shape. Cut the beam." And then, with slow, steady strokes, he began. The day after Daniel's evaluation, the school buzzed with rumors. Some students said he had aced the problem in under 20 minutes. Others claimed the professors had looked at each other with an expression they had never seen before, part surprise, part respect. Daniel walked into the cafeteria, balancing his tray, when a thin voice from behind called out, "Hey, janitor's kid!" He froze. It was Marcus, a senior from the advanced physics group, always surrounded by his friends. "Nice trick in the seminar," Marcus sneered. "Too bad everyone knows it wasn't really yours." Daniel opened his mouth, but a sudden shadow fell between them. It was Eleanor. "Keep walking, Daniel," she said quietly. Marcus tried to smirk at her, but his friends had already turned away. There was something in Eleanor's gaze that unsettled them. Not anger, but the calm weight of someone who had nothing to prove. That evening, Eleanor stayed late to finish mopping the second floor. She was halfway down the hall when she heard two maintenance workers talking in the lounge. "You see the picture in the library archive?" one said. "That conference shot from Cambridge back in the 90s? "Yeah," the other replied. "That's our Eleanor in it. Didn't know she was ever a scholar. Thought she'd always been a janitor." Eleanor set her mop aside. She walked to the lounge doorway, leaning lightly against the frame. "Let me see it," she said. One of the men turned his phone around. The screen showed a photograph of a tall lecture hall. The caption read, "Isaac Newton Institute for Mathematical Sciences, Cambridge." In the front row stood a younger Eleanor, dark hair pulled back, wearing a navy blazer, between two men in suits. Her gaze in the photo was the same as it was now, steady, curious, alive. That night, she sat in her small kitchen, the photograph printed from the archive lying on the table. The single overhead light flickered slightly, casting her shadow over the image. She remembered the morning it was taken. It had been the final day of a workshop on Diophantine equations. She had presented a paper co-authored with her husband, Michael. The work had drawn attention for its unconventional approach, blending geometry with number theory to attack problems that had resisted standard methods. Michael had been beaming that day. Later, in the quiet of their flat, he had said, "We're just getting started, Ellie. The next few years are going to be incredible." But those years had not unfolded as planned. Michael's illness came suddenly. At first, it was headaches and fatigue, then confusion. Tests revealed an aggressive brain tumor. The surgery bought him months, but not years. Eleanor had sat beside his hospital bed, reading aloud from journals, even when he could no longer respond. She still remembered the smell of antiseptic, the faint beeping of monitors, and the way his hand would twitch whenever she mentioned an idea they had once debated late into the night. When he was gone, the world of mathematics felt hollow. She packed away their papers, declined conference invitations, and left Cambridge. Princeton had been the first place that offered her work, not as a researcher, but as part of the custodial staff. It was quiet work. No one asked questions. And that was how she wanted it. The following week, Daniel arrived for their usual evening session, but found Eleanor sitting at the desk with the printed photo in front of her. "Is that you?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "In Cambridge?" "Yes." He sat down slowly. "So you really did work on these problems?" Eleanor nodded. "I was part of a small team that explored alternative approaches to old conjectures. We didn't solve them all, but we got close on a few. Close enough that some people still remember." "Why did you stop?" Daniel asked. She traced the edge of the photo with her finger. "Because sometimes life gives you a problem you can't solve on paper." They worked in silence for a while. Then, as Daniel packed up his notebook, he said, "You could go back, teach, research." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Maybe. But right now, my work is here, with you." The next day, word of the Cambridge photo spread. A few teachers stopped Eleanor in the hallway. Some were genuinely curious. Others seemed skeptical, as if the idea of a janitor once being a mathematician violated some unspoken order. Professor Harlan was among the latter. He caught her outside the faculty lounge. "So it's true," he said. "You were at Cambridge." "I was," she replied evenly. "And yet here you are, mopping floors. Why is that?" Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Because life is not a straight line, Professor. You should know that." He gave a thin smile, but his eyes held something sharper. "Perhaps you'll be willing to demonstrate your skills for the faculty sometime." "Perhaps," she said, and walked away. That evening, Daniel noticed a change in Eleanor. She seemed quieter, her eyes distant, as if measuring something unseen. Are you worried about what they'll say? He asked. I'm worried about what they'll do, she replied. They don't like having their assumptions challenged. But sometimes, Daniel, you have to let them see the truth, whether they like it or not. In the days that followed, Eleanor began slipping more of her own techniques into their sessions. Elegant shortcuts, alternative proofs, ways of visualizing abstract structures that Daniel had never seen in textbooks. One night, she drew a series of circles and lines on the board. This is not just geometry, she said. It's a map of relationships between numbers. If you can see the pattern in the shapes, you can predict the behavior of the equations without doing every calculation. Daniel stared at it, the lines beginning to make sense. This is beautiful, he said. Eleanor smiled. It is. Mathematics is a kind of art. You just have to learn to see the canvas. But outside their classroom, the tension was building. Rumors about the janitor mathematician reached parents, board members, and alumni. Some thought it inspiring. Others called it a distraction from the school's serious academic mission. Principal Morton called Eleanor into his office one afternoon. There's talk of inviting you to give a demonstration, he said. But there's also pushback from faculty who feel this situation undermines their authority. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Do you want me to refuse? She asked. I want to know what you want, he said. She thought for a long moment. I want to show them that intelligence wears many uniforms. That night, after Daniel left, Eleanor stayed in the empty classroom. She stood at the blackboard, chalk in hand, and began sketching out one of the problems she had worked on years ago. The symbols felt like old friends. For the first time in years, she was not hiding from them. Somewhere deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The old math wing was silent at night. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly in the hallway. But in room 2B, only a single desk lamp cast a warm circle onto the blackboard. Eleanor stood at the board, chalk between her fingers. Daniel sat 2 rows back, his notebook open, a pencil balanced across the spiral binding. The clock on the wall read 10:15. Why are we here so late? He asked, stifling a yawn. Because sometimes, Eleanor said, the mind works better when the rest of the world is asleep. Fewer distractions. Just you, the problem, and the quiet. She began to draw on the board. Not numbers, but shapes. A long rectangle. She divided it into 4 equal parts. Picture this, she said. 4 divided by n. This whole rectangle is the number 4 over n. Now, we are going to cut it into 3 pieces. Each piece will be the size of 1 over A, 1 over B, and 1 over C. That is all the Erdos-Strauss conjecture says. But here is the trick. How do you make those pieces fit exactly without waste? Daniel leaned forward. So it's like a puzzle. Exactly. Mathematics is often just a puzzle in disguise. Eleanor erased the shapes and replaced them with 3 large circles connected by lines. This is a network, she explained. Each circle is a number. Each line between them is a relationship. If you understand the relationships, you can often see the answer without doing every calculation. Daniel tilted his head. Like a map of numbers? Yes, she said. When I worked in Cambridge, we used diagrams like this for Diophantine problems, equations that only accept whole number solutions. We were trying to find patterns in where those whole numbers hide. She pointed to a set of lines converging on one circle. See this? If this number grows, these 2 shrink. It's balance. And balance is the soul of mathematics. They worked through problems until nearly midnight. Eleanor would pose a question, then wait as Daniel tried, erased, and tried again. She never gave the answer outright. When he grew frustrated, she would lean back in her chair and say, "Stop looking for the answer. Start looking for the path. Sometimes the answer is just the natural place the path ends. During one break, Daniel asked, "Why do you make me draw so many pictures? Most teachers just have us calculate." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Because numbers are only half the story. The other half is how you see them. If you can see a problem in more than one way, you can usually solve it. That is why architects sketch before they measure, why composers hum before they write notes. It's the same with math." She drew a quick spiral on the board. This is the Fibonacci sequence as a shape. Each square's side length is the next number in the sequence. And when you connect the corners, you get this curve. The numbers and the curve are the same truth, just in different clothes. Daniel studied it for a moment. "That's actually beautiful." "Mathematics often is," she said quietly. As the lessons went on, Eleanor began introducing concepts far beyond the high school syllabus, but she explained them with patience. Modular arithmetic became a clock face where numbers wrapped around after 12. Prime factorization became breaking a stick into pieces that could not be split any further. One night, she introduced him to a method for quickly testing whether certain kinds of equations could have whole number solutions. "Mathematicians call this a descent," she explained. "You show that if a solution exists, there must also be a smaller one. And if you can keep finding smaller and smaller ones, eventually you reach a contradiction. No smallest solution exists, so no solution exists at all." Daniel tried it on the example she gave. "So it's like pulling a thread until the whole sweater unravels." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Exactly." But these midnight lessons were not just about mathematics. They became a quiet refuge for both of them. Daniel would sometimes talk about his mother, who worked double shifts at the diner to keep the bills paid. Eleanor would tell small pieces of her life in Cambridge, carefully choosing which memories to share. One night, Daniel asked, "Do you miss it? The research? The conferences?" Eleanor rested her chin on her hand. "Some days, yes, but other days, I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Life has a way of moving us to the place where our work matters most, even if it doesn't look like what we imagined." One particularly cold night, snow tapping softly at the window, Daniel was struggling with a problem involving prime numbers spaced in a certain way. He had filled half a page with crossed-out attempts. Eleanor walked up to the board and drew two tall columns, labeling them possible and impossible. "Instead of trying to solve the whole thing, start by sorting the cases into what could work and what cannot. This reduces the infinite possibilities to something you can hold in your hands." Daniel began sorting. Within minutes, the answer became obvious. He looked at her in disbelief. "I was making it so much harder than it had to be," she chuckled. "Mathematics punishes haste and rewards clarity." The more they worked, the more Daniel's thinking began to change. He was no longer rushing toward the answer, but exploring the landscape of the problem. And Eleanor, seeing this change, felt something in herself slowly reawaken. One night, after Daniel had gone, she stayed in the classroom a little longer. She looked at the diagrams on the board, not just his work, but hers too, and realized that for the first time in years, she felt like a mathematician again. She set the chalk down carefully, as if closing a book she would soon reopen. Outside, the snow had stopped. The campus was silent except for the crunch of her boots on the path. Somewhere far away, she could hear the faint bell of the old clock tower marking midnight. And in that quiet, Eleanor knew the month they had been given was not just Daniel's chance to prove himself, it was hers too. The week after winter break, the sky over Princeton was pale and heavy with low clouds. The cold made the marble steps outside the main hall slick with frost. Students hurried in and out, clutching steaming coffee cups. Inside, the advanced mathematics seminar was buzzing with quiet conversation. At the front of the room, Professor Harlan stood by the blackboard, arms crossed, a piece of chalk tapping lightly against his palm. When Daniel entered, Harlan's eyes followed him. "Take a seat, Mr. Reed," the professor said. "Today, we are going to do something different." Daniel felt a twinge of unease. He slid into his usual place near the back. Harlan turned to the board and began writing a new problem. It wasn't from the syllabus. Even from a distance, Daniel could see it was intricate, a tangle of fractions, prime factors, and constraints that didn't look familiar. When he finished, Harlan turned back to the class. "This problem," he said, "is adapted from an unsolved question in combinatorial number theory. I will need a volunteer to attempt it at the board." No one moved. Harlan's gaze swept the room before settling on Daniel. "Mr. Reed, since you seem to have a knack for tackling the unusual, why don't you join us up here?" Daniel's stomach tightened. He could feel every eye in the room on him. Slowly, he stood and made his way to the front. The problem looked worse up close. There was no obvious starting point. He could sense the structure, the way certain terms seemed to balance or oppose each other, but the path forward was hidden. He began carefully, rewriting parts of the problem, isolating variables, testing small values to get a feel for the behavior. The first few steps flowed easily enough. A few students nodded, impressed. Then, halfway through, he hit a wall. Every manipulation he tried led to a dead end or an expression more complicated than the one before. His pencil hovered in midair. "Having trouble?" Harlan's voice was calm, but Daniel heard the undercurrent. Daniel took a slow breath, trying to remember Eleanor's advice. Look for the path, not just the answer. He erased a section and started again from an earlier point. This time he made more progress. 2 lines, 3, and then stopped. The final simplification eluded him. In the hallway outside, Eleanor was pushing her mop bucket toward the stairwell. She wasn't supposed to be near the seminar rooms during class hours, but she liked to listen. The sound of chalk and low voices had always been like music to her. She paused by the heavy oak door of room 203. Through the narrow glass panel, she could see Daniel at the board, frozen mid-step, the chalk trembling slightly in his hand. Her eyes dropped to the equation. Even from here, she could see where he was stuck, and she could see something else, a flaw, small but critical, in the problem itself. Inside, Harlan spoke again. "Interesting. It appears your method has reached its limit." A few students chuckled softly. Daniel tightened his grip on the chalk. He hated the feeling of being cornered, of having his competence judged by a single moment. Eleanor pushed the door open quietly. She stepped inside, the sound of the hinges drawing a few glances. Harlan frowned. "This is a closed seminar, Ms. Eleanor. Please." She raised a hand, her tone calm. "Just a moment. May I look?" Without waiting for permission, she walked to the board. Her eyes traced Daniel's work, then the original problem. She picked up a fresh piece of chalk. "You set this up assuming a certain symmetry in the initial conditions," she said, pointing to the top line. "But that symmetry doesn't actually hold for the values you've specified. It breaks here." She tapped the board lightly. Harlan's jaw tightened. "And how would you know that?" Eleanor glanced at him. "Because I worked on a version of this at Cambridge 15 years ago." A stunned silence filled the room. She turned to Daniel. "You were close. You just needed to reframe it." In a few clean lines, she rewrote the middle section of his work, shifting the perspective from individual terms to the structure of the equation as a whole. The path to the solution appeared almost immediately. "There," she said softly, stepping back. Daniel finished the last line himself. The chalk clicked lightly into the tray. No one spoke for a long moment. Then a voice from the back said, She's the janitor, right? Eleanor turned toward the class, her eyes steady. Yes, I am the janitor, and I can still see when a problem is worth solving. She walked toward the door, her mop bucket waiting in the hall. Behind her, Daniel stood straighter. He looked at the completed solution on the board, then at Harlan. For the first time, the professor said nothing. The next day, the story of what happened in room 203 was already spreading across Princeton high scholars. Some students told it with awe, how the janitor had walked in, spotted the flaw, and finished the problem. Others told it like a scandal, a strange woman disrupting a formal seminar, embarrassing a senior professor. By mid-morning, Principal Morton's office had received 3 calls from faculty and 2 from parents. The principal decided to settle the matter quickly. That afternoon, Eleanor was summoned to the faculty conference room. When she arrived, she found a dozen professors seated around the long oak table, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Harlan sat near the head of the table, his fingers steepled, eyes sharp. Principal Morton gestured to an empty chair. "Ms. Eleanor, please sit. Some of our faculty have questions for you." She sat, folding her hands in her lap. Harlan was the first to speak. "Yesterday, you claimed familiarity with a complex number theory problem because you had worked on it at Cambridge. Can you substantiate that claim?" Eleanor met his gaze evenly. "Yes." "How?" he asked. She looked toward the blackboard at the far end of the room. "By solving something you choose, right now, in front of all of you." A ripple of surprise moved around the table. Professor Lin, a quiet but respected member of the department, spoke up. "If we're going to test her, it should be fair." Something difficult but well-defined. Within minutes they had agreed on a problem, a well-known but notoriously tricky Diophantine equation that required both creativity and deep understanding. Lin wrote it neatly on the board. Eleanor walked to the front, picked up the chalk, and studied the equation. She didn't rush. Her eyes moved over the symbols like someone reading a familiar map. "Most people approach this by direct substitution," she began, her voice calm. "But that leads to a mess of calculations. I prefer to reframe it." She drew a simple diagram, 3 points connected by lines. Think of these as the variables. The lines represent constraints between them. If one changes, the others adjust to maintain balance. This way you can see the structure before touching the numbers. The room was silent except for the soft scrape of chalk. In less than 5 minutes, she had transformed the problem into a form that revealed an elegant shortcut. She solved it twice, once using the diagram's logic and once with the traditional algebraic method, arriving at the same answer. When she set the chalk down, there was a faint white dust on her fingertips, and the equation stood complete. Professor Lin leaned back, clearly impressed. "You've presented 2 valid solutions. And your diagram method. I've never seen it explained so clearly." Harlan's voice was tight. "That was competent. But it doesn't prove your Cambridge story." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Perhaps this will." She reached into her worn satchel and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were photocopies of academic papers, her name printed beneath Michael Turner's, the man who had been her husband. Conference programs from the Isaac Newton Institute. A photograph of her at a blackboard, mid-lecture, with the date stamped across the bottom. She placed them on the table. "I was there. I worked with some of the best minds in number theory, and then, when my husband died, I walked away. Not because I couldn't continue, but because I didn't want to. I needed quiet. This job gave me that." The room was still. For the first time, even Harlan seemed uncertain. Principal Morton cleared his throat. "Ms. Eleanor, no one here doubts your skill now. The question is, what do you want to do with it?" Eleanor looked toward the window, where pale winter light was spilling across the floor. I want to teach students who have been told they can't. Students like Daniel. I want to show them that intelligence isn't about where you start, but how far you're willing to go. From the doorway, a voice spoke. I'd sign up for that class. Everyone turned. Daniel was standing there, his hands in his pockets, trying to look casual, but there was a faint flush in his cheeks. Several professors exchanged glances. In that moment, the idea of Eleanor teaching didn't seem so far-fetched. Before the meeting ended, Lynn suggested a small pilot program. Eleanor would mentor a group of students who had been struggling in advanced math. The results would decide whether her methods could be adopted more widely. Harlan didn't object, but his silence felt less like approval and more like a retreat to plan his next move. Eleanor gathered her papers, slipped them back into the satchel, and left the room. In the hallway, Daniel caught up to her. You didn't have to do that for me, he said. She smiled faintly. Maybe not, but some problems are worth solving. The first week of Eleanor's pilot program began quietly. She was assigned a small, unused classroom in the East Wing, a space that smelled faintly of chalk dust and old varnish. The group she would mentor was a mix of students from different grades, each with a file that read inconsistent performance or lacking focus. Daniel was there, of course, but so was Mira, a junior who doodled in the margins instead of taking notes, and Alex, a senior football player who had barely passed algebra. Eleanor greeted them with a simple, "We start fresh here. No grades, no titles, no assumptions." The sessions were unlike anything the students had experienced. Instead of jumping into equations, Eleanor gave them puzzles, folding paper into geometric shapes, arranging strings to represent number relationships, even walking around the room to act out transformations. One afternoon, she asked them to pair up and invent a game that involved prime numbers. By the end of the hour, Alex was arguing excitedly with Mira about whether 13 could block 21 under their rules. For the first time, the group's laughter echoed through the math wing. But not everyone was pleased. In the faculty lounge, Professor Klein was stirring sugar into his tea when Harlan walked in. "Have you seen what's going on in the East Wing?" Klein asked. "She's turning mathematics into theater." "It won't last," Harlan replied. "Sooner or later they'll see she can't sustain it." Klein frowned. "Careful. If those kids start showing results, she might have a case." Harlan's jaw tightened. "Then we'll make sure the test is rigorous enough to expose the gap." By the second week, word of Eleanor's unconventional methods had spread. Some teachers were curious. Others dismissed it as a distraction. During a faculty meeting, one of the science teachers said, "She may be a good storyteller, but can she produce measurable improvement?" Eleanor, who had been invited to present a brief update, answered calmly. "Improvement is not just a higher score on a test. It's the moment a student stops saying, 'I can't,' and starts asking, 'What if?' But if you want numbers, we'll get numbers." That same afternoon, Principal Morton visited her classroom unannounced. He stood quietly in the doorway, watching as Eleanor guided the students through a problem about dividing a large number into 3-unit fractions. Daniel was at the board, explaining his reasoning while Mira and Alex debated the next step. When they reached the solution, Alex, who once claimed math was useless, grinned like he'd scored a winning touchdown. Morton nodded slightly and left without interrupting. Still, the resistance persisted. 3 days later, Eleanor was called to a special faculty session. A new challenge had been prepared. A problem considered difficult even for graduate students. She was told to solve it immediately in front of the group. Professor Klein presented it on the board. A system of equations with constraints that made most standard approaches fail. Eleanor studied it, aware of the quiet anticipation in the room. "Interesting choice," she said. "You've disguised a lattice problem inside a set of constraints. Let's unwrap it." She began drawing a grid, labeling points as possible solutions. Slowly, she narrowed the search space, eliminating impossibilities with each pass. Within 12 minutes, she had reduced it to a single valid set of numbers. She turned to Klein. "Would you like me to show a second approach in case you think this one was a trick?" Klein's lips pressed into a thin line. "That won't be necessary." The next day, Daniel caught up with her in the hallway. "They keep trying to make you slip," he said. Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's because they're not sure what to do with me if I don't. But the more they push, the clearer it will be that this is not a fluke." She looked toward the East Wing, where her students were beginning to gather for the afternoon session. "Come on, we've got work to do." Over the following weeks, the group's progress was undeniable. Mira began turning in full pages of solutions instead of half-finished scribbles. Alex could factor large numbers in his head faster than most of the honors students. Daniel's proofs were cleaner, more concise, almost elegant. One afternoon, after the others had left, Daniel lingered. "You know, when they first gave me a month to prove myself, I thought it was just about surviving. But now," he hesitated. "Now I think I'm actually getting good at this." Eleanor rested a hand on his shoulder. "You were always capable. You just needed someone to believe it before you did." But in the background, Harlan and a few allies were already planning the next move. The board would soon meet to decide whether Eleanor's program would be allowed to continue, and Harlan intended to make sure the answer was no. Eleanor, sensing the storm coming, began preparing not just her students, but herself. She knew the hardest test was still ahead. The East Wing classroom was still quiet when Eleanor arrived early that Monday morning. Outside, frost covered the windows, softening the edges of the world. She set down her satchel and began arranging the desks in a loose circle instead of neat rows. Daniel was the first to enter, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "One's for you," he said, handing her the warmer cup. "Thank you," she replied. "We're going to need it today." He frowned. "Why?" "Something's up, isn't it?" Eleanor nodded. "Midterm week starts tomorrow. The faculty will be watching your group's results very closely, and if we do this right, you won't just pass, you'll surprise them." By mid-morning, the other students arrived. Mira dropped into her seat with her usual slouch, but there was a spark in her eyes. Alex lumbered in, carrying a spiral notebook already half-filled with numbers and diagrams. Eleanor didn't start with a lecture. Instead, she handed out 3 problems, each more complex than the ones they had worked on before. "These aren't from your exams," she explained. "They're harder, but if you can do these, the exams will feel simple." The first was a number partitioning puzzle. The second, a geometry problem disguised as an algebra question. The third was pure logic. No numbers at all, just relationships that had to fit together without contradiction. At first, the room filled with the sound of scratching pencils, muttered guesses, and occasional sighs. But slowly, the sighs turned into quiet bursts of excitement. "I think I've got it," Mira said, sitting up straighter. Alex grinned. "Me too. This is actually kind of fun." For the rest of the week, Eleanor's group met every day, even during lunch. They worked not just on solving problems, but on explaining them. To each other, to her, and even to imaginary audiences. "You're not just learning to get the right answer," she told them. "You're learning to show how you got there. That's how mathematicians talk to the world." On Friday, the first midterm scores came in. Mira, who had failed her last 2 exams, scored 89. Alex, who had barely passed before, earned an 84. Daniel scored 96, his highest mark in the program. But the real surprise wasn't just the numbers. It was how they reacted. Instead of celebrating alone, they stayed after class to check each other's work, pointing out what could be done even better next time. "They're starting to think like mathematicians," Eleanor thought. That weekend, Principal Morton sent her an email. The board has been informed of your students' results. Some members are impressed. Others remain skeptical. They've requested a demonstration before the next board meeting. Eleanor read the message twice, then closed her laptop. She knew what it meant. They wanted to see if these weak students could perform under pressure. On Monday, she told the group. So they want to test us, Alex said. No, Eleanor corrected. They want to see if they were wrong about you. And they were. She wrote a date on the board, Friday afternoon. That's when you'll each stand in front of an audience and solve a problem you've never seen before. The point isn't to be perfect. It's to show them how you think. Mira bit her lip. In front of the board members? And the professors? Yes, Eleanor said. And I'll be right there. The rest of the week was a blur of preparation. They practiced on the blackboard, explaining each step aloud. Eleanor drilled them on strategies for when they got stuck. Break the problem into smaller pieces. Look for patterns. Change the perspective. On Thursday night, after everyone left, Daniel lingered. Do you think they'll really change their minds? He asked. Eleanor looked at him. Not all of them, but enough. Friday arrived. The demonstration was held in the same large seminar room where Daniel had once stood frozen at the board. This time, he walked in with his head high. Mira and Alex followed, exchanging nervous glances but staying close. The audience was larger than expected, professors, board members, a few curious students. Harlan was seated near the front, his expression unreadable. Principal Morton welcomed everyone, then stepped aside. Ms. Eleanor's students will each tackle a problem selected by our faculty. They've had no prior access to these questions. Mira went first. Her problem involved factoring a large number into primes. She began slowly, explaining her reasoning as she went. At one point, she made a small error, then caught it herself and corrected it. When she finished, there was a polite ripple of applause. Alex followed, facing a geometry problem that required translating a shape into an algebraic form. He used one of Eleanor's visualization tricks, sketching the shape before writing a single equation. His answer was correct. Finally, Daniel approached the board. His problem was deceptively simple, an equation that seemed solvable in one step, but hid a trap. He paused, scanning it. Eleanor saw the moment he recognized the trick. He smiled faintly and began. Within minutes, he had the solution. He set the chalk down, turned, and explained why the straightforward method would have failed. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then Professor Lin began to clap. Others followed. Even some of the students in the back joined in. Harlan didn't clap, but he didn't speak either. Afterward, as the group gathered their things, Mira whispered, "I think we just did it." Eleanor smiled. "You did more than that. You proved them wrong." But she knew the fight wasn't over. The boardroom battle was coming, and in that arena, applause would not be enough. The boardroom at Princeton High Scholars was a place designed to intimidate. Dark mahogany walls, oil paintings of past principals, and a long, polished table that could seat 20 without crowding. At the far end hung the school crest, lit by a spotlight as if to remind everyone of the weight of tradition. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor walked in with her satchel and a calm expression. Daniel, Mira, and Alex were already waiting in the hallway with a few parents. "Remember," she told them quietly, "this is not just about numbers. It's about showing them what kind of people you've become." They nodded. Inside, the board members were seated. Principal Morton was at the head of the table, flanked by faculty representatives, including Professor Harlan, his hands folded neatly, and Professor Lin, who offered Eleanor a small, encouraging smile. Morton began. "We are here to discuss the future of Ms. Eleanor's mathematics mentorship program. The results from her students' midterms and the public demonstration are on record. We will hear arguments from both sides before making a decision. Harlan spoke first. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. While the improvement in her students' scores is commendable, I remain concerned about the sustainability of such gains. Anecdotal success does not equal a reliable educational method. Furthermore, Ms. Eleanor has no formal teaching credentials. He gestured toward a folder in front of him. I have compiled reports from other faculty noting that her approach is unconventional, sometimes bordering on unstructured. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When Morton turned to her, she stood. I appreciate Professor Harlan's concerns, she began. But I'd like to remind the board that my students were not just underperforming. They were considered lost causes. In 8 weeks, they went from being written off to solving problems in front of the very professors who once doubted them. She opened her satchel and pulled out a stack of notebooks. These are their workbooks. Every page shows the path to each solution, not just the answer. That is not unstructured learning. That is discipline, curiosity, and resilience. Professor Lin spoke next. I observed Ms. Eleanor's sessions twice. What I saw was a level of student engagement we often struggle to achieve in our own classes. The methods may be unconventional, but the results speak for themselves. From the back of the room, a voice said, "May I speak?" It was Daniel's mother. She stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly. My son used to come home angry at himself every day. He thought he didn't belong here. Since working with Ms. Eleanor, I've seen him light up about learning again. She hasn't just taught him math, she's given him back his confidence. Mira's father spoke next, describing how his daughter now stayed up late to finish problem sets instead of avoiding them. Alex's coach chimed in, noting the discipline Alex had begun showing on and off the field. Harlan's jaw tightened. Emotional appeals are not evidence. Daniel, who had been silent until now, stood. Then let me give you evidence, he said. He took a piece of chalk from the tray by the board and began writing. The problem he wrote was not from any test. It was one Eleanor had given him just last night, complex enough to challenge, but clear enough to finish in minutes if you knew the right approach. As he worked, he explained each step, pausing to point out why he chose one path over another. When he finished, he turned to the board members. 6 weeks ago, I couldn't have done this. I can now because someone believed I could. The room was quiet. Even the ticking of the old wall clock seemed loud. Principal Morton cleared his throat. I believe we have heard enough. The decision will be made now. The board members leaned toward one another, speaking in low voices. After a few minutes, Morton looked up. By a vote of 9-3, the board approves the continuation of the adaptive mathematics program under Ms. Eleanor's guidance. Mira let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Alex grinned openly. Daniel glanced at Eleanor, who simply nodded, her expression calm, but her eyes bright. Harlan stood, collecting his papers without a word, and left the room. As people began to file out, Morton approached Eleanor. You've made quite an impression. I suspect this is only the beginning. Eleanor smiled faintly. Beginnings are good. They mean there's work to be done. The morning after the board's decision, the East Wing classroom looked different. Sunlight spilled across the desks, dust motes dancing in the air. On the front wall, a new sign had been hung. Adaptive Mathematics Program. Instructor, Eleanor Turner. It was the first time Eleanor had seen her name on anything at the school that wasn't a custodial schedule. She unlocked the door early and walked in carrying a small cardboard box. Inside were the few personal items she had kept over the years. A worn leather notebook, a fountain pen from Cambridge, and a single photograph of her and Michael, both smiling in front of a blackboard. She placed the photo on the desk, then set the notebook beside it. Finally, she pulled out her folded custodian's uniform. the same faded blue she had worn every day for 7 years, and hung it on a small wooden peg by the door. Above it, she pinned a hand-lettered card, "Never judge a mind by its uniform." When Daniel arrived, he stopped in the doorway. "You're really not wearing it anymore." Eleanor shook her head. "No more hiding." The first official day of her program felt like a celebration. Her small group of students had doubled. Word had spread after the demonstration. Some were advanced students who wanted to learn her visualization methods. Others were kids who had been told they weren't math people. Eleanor greeted each one with the same phrase, "Welcome. You start fresh here." She began with a problem simple enough for everyone to follow, but layered enough to invite deeper thought, dividing a whole into parts in more than one way. As the students worked, she moved among them, offering hints when needed, asking questions that nudged them toward the next insight. The room buzzed with quiet energy, the kind of focus that comes not from fear of failure, but from the pull of curiosity. During a break, Daniel wandered over to the blackboard and began sketching one of Eleanor's network diagrams for a problem he'd been thinking about on his own. A younger student, curious, asked him to explain it. Without hesitation, Daniel walked her through the connections, showing how one change rippled through the rest of the system. Eleanor watched from her desk, recognizing the same steady tone she had once used with him. The passing on of knowledge had already begun. Late in the afternoon, a girl in a cafeteria apron lingered at the doorway. "Ms. Eleanor?" she asked shyly. "My mom works in the kitchen here. She said maybe you could help me with something?" Eleanor smiled. "Of course. Come in." The girl stepped inside and handed her a crumpled worksheet. The problem was tricky, a set of fractions to be added with unlike denominators. Eleanor sat beside her. "Imagine these are slices of different-sized pies," she said. "We're going to cut them so they all match." Within minutes, the girl's eyes lit up. "I get it now!" From the corner, Daniel watched, remembering his own first lesson with Eleanor. As the day wound down, the last of the students left, their voices fading down the hall. Eleanor remained in the quiet classroom, erasing the blackboard until it was clean. She stood for a moment looking at the empty desks, then at the uniform still hanging by the door. It wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a reminder of every step that had brought her here, every assumption she had quietly disproved. Daniel returned briefly, leaning against the doorway. "You know," he said, "I think we're just getting started." Eleanor smiled. "Yes, we are." Outside, the winter light was fading, and the first stars were appearing in the clear sky. Inside, the little classroom in the East Wing felt warmer than any place Eleanor had been in a long time, not because of the radiator, but because of the minds inside it, growing, questioning, believing. For the first time since Cambridge, she allowed herself to think not about what she had lost, but about what she could still give. And she knew, deep in her bones, that was enough. Some of the brightest minds never step onto a lecture stage or receive an award under bright lights. They live quietly behind closed doors, among the scent of floor polish and the sound of a broom sweeping a hallway. But when those minds meet the right person, at the right moment, they can flare to life like embers stirred by a sudden breeze. Eleanor never returned to Cambridge. She never wore a professor's robe again. Instead, she chose a small classroom tucked away in the corner of the school, a place where students once dismissed as not math people found their way back to belief. There, each problem was not just a number, but a story of how a soul, even after being battered, can still light the path for others. And sometimes, the greatest legacy we leave is not in the work that bears our name, but in the eyes of a new generation as they realize I can do this too. Thank you for listening to this story, and for walking through each chapter of Eleanor's life with me. I hope, somewhere in it, you found a spark of warmth to keep, like a quiet ember glowing on a winter night.